Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Juan Garcia with the Irvine Ranch Water District. I'm the Senior Landscape Specialist. Today's workshop is going to be hosted by, of course, the UCCE Master Gardeners of Orange County. Before we begin with the presentation on Composting 101, a little bit of housekeeping. Your microphone will be muted. Let's see really quick here. And just thank you for joining us for the Composting 101. I hope you're all super excited to be here because we are super excited to have you join us. Um, let's see, before we get started, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items with you to remember throughout the event. You will notice that your microphones are already muted. This helps to allow our video presentation to run smoothly and to avoid any distractions. During the presentation, you will have the opportunity to win one of our awesome water efficiency kits. We are going to be giving out a total of 6 efficiency kits. There will be 3 questions within the presentation, so please make sure to listen carefully. We will provide you with instructions on how to send your answers, and every correct answer will then be entered into our random drawing for one of these lovely kits. Also, we will be sending you an email which will include a link to the presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted on one of our hosting websites. We will be hopefully also during the presentation, we'll be gathering questions and also be answering them as well. So you're going to be getting an email with handouts and a bunch of information as far as programs and future events. Within the email as well, we're going to have the list of the water efficiency kit winners and other information. There will be a Q&A session at the very end of the presentation, so definitely stick around for that. We have actually we have, oh my gosh, a number of master gardeners. I think we have maybe 6 or 7 master gardeners online right now with us as well, as well as the presenter, Mr. Greg Stevenson. But we'll be able to address any questions you might have. So one thing I do want you to get familiar with is the chat feature. The chat feature is the best way to submit your questions. Any questions that you may have, go ahead and start typing it into that chat feature. And once again, our master gardeners are there looking at the questions, and they will be addressing them as best as possible at the very end. And if we don't get a chance to go through them, I'm sure we'll be able to answer them and submit them through the email. So once again, the best way to do this is click the drop down arrow in the chat area of your screen, choose everyone, then submit your questions. By doing this, it helps our team to ensure your questions are collected and answered properly. Now, should you have any technical issues during the workshop, please contact our help desk line at 949-453-5656, and an IRWD representative will be available to assist you. So let's test the chat feature right now, everybody, by having everybody type in what community or city you are joining us from. And remember to choose everyone as an option in posting your comments. So let's all practice, everybody. And let's see what kind of responses we start to get. Excellent. So they're coming in. Mission Viejo, great. Portola, Irvine, Newport, Fullerton. We see some HB. Great, great, great. See if anybody from afar. It happens every once in a while, but here we go. Fantastic. Okay. Great. Thank you, everybody, for participating in this. It looks like we have over 100 attendees so far, and the number keeps going up as we speak. So with that said, let's go ahead and get this presentation started. Mr. Greg. So today's presentation, Composting 101, reusing green resources to restore soil health. This presentation this is going to be presented by Mr. Greg Stevenson, and he is a book of knowledge. He is a programmer by profession and an edible gardener by passion. However, if you ask his wife, she will say it is more than an obsession. That sounds like me for some of the things. He has been a resident of Orange County his entire adult life. His parents made him squander his early years in Long Beach and Lakewood. He has been married for 45 years, has 2 grown children and 4 grandchildren. In 2010, Greg started speaking about organic gardening on a regular basis. That year, he organized what grew into the largest gardening meetup in Orange County with over 800 members. In 2013, he joined the UCCE Master Gardeners of Orange County and is also a master composter. He is an active member of their Speakers Bureau and regularly gives talks on all aspects of edible gardening, irrigation, and composting. Wow. With that said, Greg, let's get this going. Awesome.
Okay, thank you very much, Juan, and thank you everybody for showing up today. We also, with UCCE Master Gardeners, have a few housekeeping slides, which I'll go through real quickly, and they help clarify who we are. Because a lot of times people see that designation UCCE and say, University of California, are you guys with Irvine? And the answer is no. I won't bother you with all the details, but under the University of California system, there are several different divisions. And the universities that you think of, like Irvine, Davis, Berkeley, and so on, they are on one branch, and then we're part of another branch, which is UC Agricultural and Natural Resources. And with that, the UCA&R cooperates with counties throughout California to bring research-based information to the public in all the counties. That includes working with farmers and companies on agricultural related issues, as well as working directly with residents. So that is UCA&R, and then the Master Gardeners are part of that, and we are the Orange County Master Gardeners, and I'm a part of that. We're a volunteer corps of UC Master Gardeners, are a volunteer corps, and our mission is to extend this research-based knowledge and information on home horticulture, pest management, sustainable landscaping, and of course, composting practices to the residents of Orange County. I don't know why they left composting off this slide because it's the most important thing in my opinion. Now, what you're going to learn today. We're going to learn the who, what, where, when, why, and how of composting. And we're going to figure out what's the right composting solution for your particular situation. Because everyone can compost, even if you live in a small apartment. We're going to talk about local sources for compost, which you might need on occasion, especially if you find that you just don't want to compost for whatever reason. I just can't imagine that, but I guess there are some people out there like that. And how to use compost in your garden, because it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to make your plants grow to their optimal potential. And then finally, we'll cover some maintenance and troubleshooting tips. And of course, if you have any additional questions, we have some time left over for that. Now, why compost? Well, there's two aspects to this. One is environmental. We have a lot of waste. And at one point in time, around 2000 or so, maybe late 1990s, over 50% of the waste that we had going into our landfill was green waste. And so we wanted to reduce that waste production. But the amazing thing is, if the compost, not only can we reduce waste, but we can create something that will make our soil extremely fertile. This also has the benefit of, by not being picked up, trucked away and everything like that, reducing air quality. As a matter of fact, composting also aids in carbon sequestration, which is a big term that you hear frequently when we're talking about global warming and things like that. And we want to conserve all the resources we can, and composting is an excellent way of doing that. Now, in terms of gardening, though, this is where the big benefits are. By spreading a thick layer of compost as a mulch on top of your property, you can save water. The IRWD likes that. And then you can also save money because you're not buying compost generated elsewhere and trucked all over the place and that. You just use your own compost. It'll enrich your soil, making your plants healthy. And as you can see from this picture, the very active composting, like gardening itself, has a moderate workout involved with it. So by composting, it helps contribute to a healthy lifestyle. It's very stress reducing as well as that moderate exercise. Now, what is compost? In a layman's level, it's when the stuff on the left-hand side of the slide almost magically transforms into what you see in this person's hands on the right side of the slide. Now, of course, the University of California has a much more formal definition of compost, and that is that compost is the biologically active material that results from microbial decomposition of organic matter under controlled conditions. Now, that's quite a mouthful, but don't let that scary and complex definition scare you away, because this is not brain surgery. The key here is that it's biologically active, and the microbial action is essential for soil health. These microorganisms break down nutrients and they hold water for the plants, and the diversity of this biome will help suppress disease in your plants. So it's just great for your plants altogether. But as a simpler definition, just remember that compost happens. You don't have to have controlled situations or whatever. As a matter of fact, Felder Rushing has this nice 2 rules of composting. Stop throwing that stuff away and pile it up somewhere. But I want to point out that Mr. Felder lives in Mississippi. And as you can see from this picture, he has a lot of property. And most of us in Irvine and the surrounding communities don't have lots that are 5 acres or so. We have very small lots, but we can still compost even with that. However, we have an advantage that Mr. Felder doesn't have. And that's because being in Mississippi, it gets really cold there in the winter and snows and what have you, and not much composting action takes place during that. But you can start composting anytime you want and take the benefits. There is no season to composting. You can do it fall, winter, summer, spring, doesn't matter at all. You can always start composting whenever you're ready. Now, we're going to address 4 basic forms of composting, and I do all 4 of these. There is hot composting, and it is fast, high-quality compost. It's recommended by the UC system. Unfortunately, you need to have a lot of feedstock. That just means a fancy word for a lot of plant material in order to make it work. And I'll sort of illustrate that with a photograph a little bit later on. It also takes a little bit more work because you need to turn your compost pile, that's a phrase, about every 2 to 3 days, and that's usually takes about 30 minutes worth of time. But at the end of that, about 8 weeks, you'll have a nice half cubic yard of compost that's just wonderful and ready to use. Cold composting, if you have a smaller property, you can do this. It's a moderate quality compost because it doesn't have the heat accelerating it, but you just go at your own pace. And so it's a real easy one for everyone to do. Vermicomposting is by far the easiest. It's the most scalable. You can start very small and work your way up if you want to. But the wonderful thing is it produces the highest quality compost you can get. Now, the only downside is that vermicomposting means actually composting with worms, and worms are living creatures. You can walk away from your hot or cold compost pile for months, even years at a time, and they won't compost as quickly, but they'll still break down. But since worms are living creatures, they need to be managed. They're sensitive to extreme heat, extreme cold. They need a certain amount of moisture. They need food. And so they're much easier to take care of than dogs or cats or even goldfish. But think of them as kind of a pet. I name all my worms. They're all named Terry. Works very well. And sort of the George Foreman way of thinking. But by calling them Terry, I remember that they're living creatures and I treat them that way. Last but not least is delegated composting. This is a term I came up with, and this is the easiest. This means that you delegate the composting effort to somebody else, which means you can either buy compost that's already been made by a third party, or you can take your green waste and you put it in a recycle container and then allow somebody else to recycle what you don't want to recycle. And there are certain greens like weeds and that even I don't compost, and so they go into that green waste bin. Now there are some additional resources, and you don't have to busily write all this down because this will be made available to you, but there are some additional resources. I just want to take this opportunity though with the green waste can to remind you to look at the label at the top, because even in terms of green waste, there are certain plant materials like palm fronds and other fibrous branches and that you don't want to place in your green waste container, and they actually need to go in the trash because they just cannot be composted effectively. So be sure and look at the label at the top of your container before you put anything like palm fronds or such things in your green waste container. Once again, vermicompost is a living soil amendment. It's created by red wigglers, redworms, and they will turn organic matter into something that looks, it's more black than normal compost, and it's just wonderful. It's considered black gold by gardeners. It's the best form of compost you can get. It's easier for the plants to take up, and there are certain things to help support your plant's life. It makes, you can see here that it's a concentrated 5 to 11 times richer in NPK, which are the fertilizer nutrients that you think about, from the material that the worms consume. It's 5 to 10 times richer than just normal composting. It's just great and contains plant hormones, it's just a wonderful, wonderful type of composting to consider. Okay, I have developed my 5 C's of composting. And in order to compost, you need to collect feedstock, that's just garden stuff, either kitchen scraps or yard waste, tree trimmings, you name it. You need to chop them up to a certain size. We'll describe that. You do the actual composting action. Then you collar or screen it. As you can tell, I was reaching for my C's at the end of this. And then you consume it. And that's using it out around your yard. You don't actually eat it, but you use it. Okay. Now, collecting. These 2 pictures show an example of how to collecting. Over on the left-hand side was my very first compost bin. I put it together with some pallets that I found. I sort of prevented the holes from going in by putting some foam insulation sheets, as you can see. And then I just, on the side next to my compost bin, I was collecting my materials. And it's just, as you can see, it's just a hodgepodge of whatever I got from clippings from the garden. Now I've changed this a little bit, and where I placed it was underneath a lemon tree. And the reason I placed it there was it was out of the way. And if you think about it, what grows under a lemon tree? Virtually nothing, because it's in the shade all the time. So it's the perfect place to put something like a compost bin. As a matter of fact, the only requirement is that the compost bin should be on ground or dirt, because if you put it on cement or something, the material can stain your cement. So you don't want that. You want it on the ground. And you also want it near a water source. So if your hose can reach it, or if you can get an extension to your hose and then reach it, you've got a spot for your compost. And a lot of us in our yards have these little nooks in that we can't use for anything else. But you can see my current composting environment on the right now has 2 bins. Each one is 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot, a cubic yard. And that's the minimum needed for hot composting, the minimum size recommended. And you can see that the pitchfork that I used, still the same pitchfork, and it's still the same lemon tree. I've just sort of pruned the branches away so that I can compost easily with it going on there. I don't collect in this area now because I collect so much material, it just wouldn't fit in this particular area. But I use this for where I have my composting. Now there's all sorts of composting bins. So what you saw me have would be about 6 foot wide and 3 foot deep, and then 3 foot high, close to the fence, but not right up against it. But you can be all sorts of creative. There's these round ones that you could put stuff in. I don't really recommend these. They're not big enough to do hot composting, but if you don't have a whole lot of material, just go with the smaller bin. And this has a hand crank, so it makes turning your compost easier. This is even easier. This little ball here, you can put the compost in and you just sort of roll it around to mix it up. There are systems that are called flow through, where you put in your matter at the top and then you pull the compost once it's done out of the bottom. Then this is very similar to what I have, except for it's made out of wire. And then there's also nice ones made out of redwood. You can do anything from something that'll cost you virtually nothing. As a matter of fact, you can look on Craigslist or any of the other sites, FreeCyclerNet. Often you'll find one that's very, very low cost or free, or you can pay up to several $1,000s for a compost bin because they're very nice. They almost look like furniture, but the compost doesn't care. You can use something very inexpensive or very cheap, very cheap. So let's go to the next slide. Worm bins. Now, worm bins can be very large and very small. The size that I use, and I've done this through years of experimentation, is this is a 10-gallon tote right here. This is what I do for all of my worms. But there's, you could have something really huge, which I don't think anybody in our area would actually have something that large. But if you are really into worms and you want to have something, you can. The key thing about the worms themselves is they're very shallow. In nature, they're right in the top part where all the leaves fall down and so on. That's the leaf litter, and that's where they live. So you don't want it to be any deeper than about 6 inches. As a matter of fact, when I'm filling this up, I fill mine up to about where this row of, just above the little marker here where those little holes are drilled. And these are 1/8 inch holes just drilled around. They are not drilled in the bottom, and there's no holes in the top. They're not really needed. And these are just to provide oxygen for the worms. You'll see other ones that are like a tiered system. And the idea is that you put your food and materials in the top, and the worms will eat it up. And then you gradually will take the bottom one off, and it's supposed to be done. And then you rotate the bottom one up to the top, and it goes through. These are called flow-through systems. They have their good points and their bad points. But usually you'll find worms in all all layers. So I found this one works. And then when I now have 16 of these, and so I get like 2 of these containers every week of fresh vermicompost that I'm able to use in my garden. Another one, this is just a different one where it sits right in the ground so the worms can go into the ground if they need to for protection from the cold or excessive heat, but they're also available right at the top. You'll see all this shredded newspaper. That's called worm bedding. We'll get to that in just a bit. But any sort of wooden or plastic container can be used for composting or vermicomposting. It should be at least a 10-gallon size, and you want it to be flatter rather than high. And even if you have a high container, you only want to fill about 6 inches, no more than that, full of bedding for the worms to live in, because once again, they're used to being at the very surface of the ground. They don't want to go very deep. Now, the components of compost. Compost consists of 4 things. 2 of them are organic. We call those browns and greens. We will get to those in just a second. And then air and water. And most of you are familiar with air. You know how to get air. It's all around us. No problem there. Water is not hard. Like I said, the only thing you need for locating your compost bin is the ability to water it, and so that it doesn't dry out. And that's a simple thing. With the worm bin, you can wet it when you first set it up, and if you take good care of it, you just have just enough moisture where everything is damp, but it doesn't have water in the bottom. It's not waterlogged, so you can not have to worry about it at all. And since there's no holes in the bottom of the systems that I use, you can even store them in the house. And worm bins and normal compost bins, if they're properly maintained, do not smell at all or actually have a pleasant odor to them. As a matter of fact, there's several restaurants now that are the farm to table type, and they actually have worm bins inside their main dining rooms. That's how confident they are that they're not going to have any problems with smell or anything. And it's a good curiosity thing for people interested in composting. Now, as far as plant material, it's categorized into 2 forms: browns, which are high in carbon, and greens, which are high in nitrogen. And when you think of it, think of stuff that's brown. It's more like dried out, like you can see the dried out leaves, dried out sticks and stuff like that. And the greens are more like fresh things that you just clipped, or leafy vegetables, or things that you just got from kitchen scraps. Now, one of the interesting things is if you put greens outside and just leave them alone, they will gradually lose their nitrogen, and what remains will turn into browns. So if you need more browns, you can start with greens and you just let them lose their nitrogen and they'll turn into browns. But you can also get browns as needed from a lot of different sources. Okay, here's our first question. I just sort of put these randomly in the deck. So in what season do we compost? Be sure and email your answer by 5 p.m. tomorrow, July 8th, to rightscape@irwd.com. In what season do we compost? Give you a few seconds on that one. And now we move on. So, carbons, or our browns. Now, if you're doing a worm bed, your browns are what we call bedding material. And that's what's in the little circle picture right here at the top. And this is my normal bedding. You can see it's made with shredded newspaper. The brown paper that brown paper bags are made out of, and then composting material. And I found a garden center that uses brown paper bags, and they cut the tops off and then just use the bottoms whenever they sell plants. And the tops, they normally just throw in the trash, but I come in every so often and I get all of their unused tops. So I'm able to reuse them as composting material. But if you have brown bags from some of the stores and that, those are all fine to use and shred to use for material. And then I also put some of my compost in here, and that's the worms will turn this from normal compost into super compost. So that's the brown materials. Then other things with low moisture content, usually like dried leaves. So I collect a bunch of those during the fall and use them. Straw, sawdust, wood chips, anything like that that has a low, is fairly dry and has a low carbon content or low nitrogen content. It's been dried out. Those are what we use as browns. Carbon is an energy source for decomposers. So more carbon is needed than nitrogen, but if you have too much, it slows decomposition. So there is a formula that we have, but it's not very complex. Nitrogen, which are our greens, is all the fresh stuff. And it's needed to start the composition process. So whenever you need to cool down your pile, if it was too hot, and that rarely ever happens, you would add more browns. If you need to heat up your pile so that it goes faster in that, you want to add greens. So the vegetable matter, fruit scraps, grass clipping, coffee, even though it's brown, is actually considered a green. Anything that is fresh vegetable matter is generally considered a green. Another thing that you can use besides coffee is the beer mash that some of our local microbreweries have. So whenever I need extra coffee grounds, I usually have more than enough whenever I start my compost piles. But if I ever need more, there's a place you guys may have heard of. It's called Starbucks. You might have one near you, and you can just go in and ask them if you can have some coffee. They have a program called Grounds for the Garden, and they'll give you all you want. I bring in 2 5-gallon buckets, and I can walk out with no problem. I also have some organic coffee shops in my area, and they also are more than happy to give me their coffee grounds. So nitrogen provides the protein materials for decomposers to build their bodies from. And with this new cell material, they're using their stored nitrogen and they burn the carbon as they're doing it. So this is the other one that we need. Now, there's this carbon to nitrogen ratio, and the optimal ratio is 30:1. And this is at the elemental level. This is what the scientists are worried about, not us as gardeners. All we need to do is have in equal volumes approximately, again, this is not rocket science, so you don't have to be exact, but roughly half of what you have will be browns by volume and half of what you have will be greens by volume. You mix those together, you're in great shape. If you get too much nitrogen, you're going to get rapid growth, and nitrogen, things that are high in nitrogen are things like urine and ammonia. And so you can think of that and you can think that will cause odor. So if you have too much, you're going to possibly smell something that smells sort of ammonia-like. And if you have too little, you're going to slow things down. So it won't be as hot or as aggressive as you want it to be. Now, when you have that perfect ratio, notice when you start your compost pile, very quickly, you're going to notice that the temperature rises. And if you have a full-size cubic yard of material, it's going to rapidly rise to about 160 degrees. Here's my thermometer over here, and a composting thermometer looks sort of like a meat thermometer, except for it's got a little bit longer stem, about 18 inches to 24 inches, so it can go right down into the center of your pile, about halfway of that 36 inches that makes up a yard. And you can see here it's about 140, 150 degrees, 160 is over here. I've had it go to about 164, I think is the highest I've ever personally seen. But it goes up and then it goes down slowly until it actually is all done. And when you're doing this, you can see that having a good ratio means that you're going to have a maximum effect. So just a good balance works. Okay, so what do we put in here? Now, this particular diagram shows you both the browns here. You know, you can see they're all dead. The browns are all dead. And you can see the greens all here. This is not how you would normally do it, but it makes for a great picture, and it lets you see what we're putting in here. For the greens, you can put in grass clippings, yard waste, leaves, even pine needles, vegetable trimmings, food scraps. However, I prefer to use vermicomposting for my vegetable trimmings and my food scraps. So I pretty much only put my yard waste in when I'm actually doing composting, and I reserve all this good stuff that they're showing here on top for my worms to eat. They love eating this stuff. And then you can have wood chips, newsprint, various items like that. Now, what does not go in the pile? Any plant that is infected with a disease. It might have powdery mildew on it. It might have something else, brown spots. You just don't know what it is. It's not a good idea to put it into your compost pile, especially if you're not able to do hot composting, and most of us aren't. Any plants with severe insect damage, again, because when you do hot composting, you can get to a certain temperature. That 160 degrees sustained for a couple of days is enough to kill off most diseases, most insects, most pathogens in general, and weed seeds. But if you're not using hot composting, usually you don't get to those real high temperature levels, and so you have to try something else. Plants, ivy, morning glory, and succulents, they have real fibery stems which don't chop up very well and don't decompose very well in composting, so we want to avoid that. When we say succulents, we mean things like yucca leaves and things like that, which are those long, thin, very fibrous leaves. And then you want to avoid a lot of animal byproducts like dog and cat manures, meat and fish, and dairy products. And those, even though they will compost, they have a tendency to smell. And most of us live next to neighbors. And they not only will the neighbors not appreciate it if these things start smelling as they decompose, the other things like rats and raccoons and opossums just love that stuff, and they'll come right to it, and you don't want them to dig around and have problems that way. So we want to avoid a lot of the meat and dairy stuff and just stick with plants for our composting. Okay, when done properly, normal compost smells earthy. So if you have a bad smell, you probably have too much moisture. That's generally not a problem when it's on the ground like this, because it's just the water will go into the ground, and we don't have a whole lot of rain. We don't get rain all the time like they do on the East Coast or something like that. So our piles aren't constantly wet because it's raining every single day. So usually too much moisture is not a problem. But if it is, we can add browns and turn it around. And if we have lots of rodents or flies, remember that picture that I showed you with everything lying on top, that's not what you want to do. If you add that items like greens like that to your compost pile, you want to bury them down several inches, like 8 to 12 inches, so that they're not available to flies or rodents. And then if your pile won't heat up, add greens. Coffee is my go-to for that, coffee grounds, but you could also add grass or whatever you have. I don't have any turf on my property anymore, so grass isn't an option, but coffee grounds are, like I said, my go-to for that. Okay, composting depends on microorganisms, macroorganisms, organic matter. We just went through that. And the key thing is the macroorganisms break things down into smaller and smaller chunks so that the microorganisms, the bacteria, can take it the last part. So what we want to do is we want to increase all those microorganisms. And in order for them to do their work, they need water and they need oxygen. So we want to keep it just like you want a good soil. It's not overly wet. It's, if you were to squeeze it, if you picked it up, it would feel wet. But if you squeezed it, no water would really come in. It's like a damp sponge. That's the feeling you want to get. And you want it nice and loose so that the oxygen can get in everywhere. Now, the way you do that is you need to have smaller particles. And up at the top, you can see this big pile of branches. And over here, we have my friend Chip. And after going through Chip, this is the pile that resulted. You can see it's much smaller than the original pile and gives these really nice small particles, just the perfect size for composting. Now, here's some bad things. This is not nearly enough to start a hot composting pile. You would need to have about 10 piles this size in order to have enough material to start hot composting. So if you can't chop it up using a chopper, you can chop it up so you can do the cool composting. And if you can't chop it up as fully because you don't have a chipper, and most of us don't, I did not start off with a chipper. You can use pruning shears, you can use loppers, you can use all sorts of things. There's also electric chippers that aren't quite as powerful, but they will handle a lot of the thinner branches. And whenever you get branches, it's a lot easier if you chop them up while they're still fresh and green, as opposed to when they've dried and hardened and dried out. So just remember that, and just, you know, listen to a podcast or the radio or something and just sort of chop things up as you get a chance. And if you can't get it perfectly, that's fine. Compost still happens. It's not rocket surgery, as we're saying. You just do the best you can and it'll work. But if you want the optimal size, running it through a chipper really helps. And then this is just an example of how this helps. Once again, this is our temperature, which is our guide as to go. If it's in 1 inch in diameter, it's almost like the optimum. 2 inches, not as good. The larger it is, the longer it's going to take, and the less temperature that it's going to reach. So once you got all this chipped stuff and you're ready to make your pile, and if it's cold composting, you can just do this incrementally as you get your material. But you can but for hot composting, you want to put the material in the pile. You want to mix it up, even greens, even browns. What I do is I throw some browns through the chipper, I throw some greens through the chipper, and it mixes them up for me automatically when I do that. And then I'll put a layer in, and then I'll smooth some coffee grounds on top of that, along with the filters. The filters are fully compostable. Then I'll add some more, and you add a little bit of water, spray it down, add some more, and you just sort of build it up, and you're going to end up with your pile at the end. You can see the last thing that the person's doing there is putting the thermometer in, so he has an idea of how hot it's going to get. But that's for the hot composting method. Cold composting, you can do the same way. It's just that you're not going to pay that much attention to the temperature, and however big your pieces are, that's just how big your pieces are. Now, one of the keys to making things compost faster is turning it. And by turning, we mean we want to make the stuff, as we mentioned, that the very center of this pile is where all the heat is. And the outside isn't nearly hot. So if we turn it, and if you noticed in the beginning, I had 2 bins. And the reason I have 2 bins is that I take the top, I start at the top, and I put that in the bottom of the next bin over on one side. And then I take the outside and I put it on the inside parts of the other of the pile, I put in that. And so I transfer it from the full bin into the empty bin. Another way is if you have just a screen like this, you simply move this to about a few feet away, and then you turn the pile into it. And those bins are such that when you open them up, the existing pile keeps its form, and you just move it into that. And then as you mix, you adjust the moisture. Usually it'll be drying out, so you add a little bit of moisture. And like I said, in our climate, you really can't add too much moisture. And then if you need to, you can adjust the heat with either adding browns to cool it, which is very rare, or greens to bring it up. But you don't want to do that constantly. Once you start on hot composting, a cycle, you're almost never adding more material. You're just working with what you have, and you're just turning it every couple days. If you're doing cool composting, you don't have to bother about how often you turn it. You just turn it when you feel like it. But the more you can turn it, the faster things will happen. And this turning also fluffs it up so that it's easy for air to get in, for the bacteria to go. Now, there are 4 types of bacteria. The main 2 that we're concerned about is these thermophilic ones. They're the ones that really raise the temperature, but they have a short work week, so they are active for about 3 to 5 days. And then when we turn the pile, we reactivate them. So they do this, and you'll get this reactivation about 2 or 3 times when you first start your one. Then the mesophilic are the ones that we have most of the time. And all these are active, and you'll have some slight temperature increase over what it would be if it was just a normal. And on a cool composting, in the center, if you use a thermometer, you'll usually still get about 110, 120 combination, because you do have some mesophilic and thermophilic bacteria that are actually working through this process. And as you can see here, it's another one. If you turn, the more often you turn, the higher your temperature is going to get on hot composting. On regular cool composting, doesn't matter as much. Now, when you're doing vermicomposting with worms, one thing that I do is to keep the bin fluffed up and the temperature, the moisture evenly distributed. I go in with my hands, I put some gloves on, and I gently churn the bedding for the worms as well, because there's a tendency for the fine stuff to go to the bottom and soak in a little bit more moisture than it's needed, and maybe dry out a little bit at the top. And by just gently churning it, doesn't bother the worms, but it keeps it nice and fluffed up, and it makes the whole process happen more evenly and more consistently. So the turning itself is really important. Here's something else to do. When you're looking at it, when you start it, it can be towards the top, and when it's finished, it'll be about half the size of when you started it, because it's all breaking down and packing in there. And so you end up with just a fraction of what you started with. Now, here's question 2. How can one make their compost pile hotter? How can one make their compost pile hotter? Same email, same due date. scratch down your answer real quick. We'll continue on. Now, how do you tell when it's done? Okay, there are two ways to tell when it's done, but the main thing is when it no longer heats up after turning. Because almost every time you turn it, it'll pick up a little bit. But if it stops doing that and just stays at about whatever the ambient temperature is, so if it's 80 degrees outside and your compost pile is 80 degrees, you know it's pretty much done. And you can remove it from your bin, or I just allow it to sit there for another couple of weeks in the bin and age for another couple of weeks before I actually use it, or in my case, I'll screen it before I use it, but that's how we use it. Now, for earthworms, it's a little bit easier. Remember the bedding that I showed you with all the particles of newspaper and shredded paper bags? When those are no longer visible, you know that your worm castings are done. So as you mix it and stuff, you look at it and go, hey, I don't see any more paper. It's done. And you can harvest your castings in a couple of different ways. What I like to do is I actually have another one of those containers I showed you that has the bottom cut out of it. And I have a third container that has fresh bedding in it with fresh food. And then I put this other container that has the bottom cut out of it, and I put a 1/4-inch hardware mesh screen in the bottom of it, and then dump the contents of the worm bin that I'm harvesting into it and leave it there overnight, and the worms sort of go down into the fresh bedding with the fresh food for them to eat. And I usually wait when I'm ready to harvest. I'll not feed them for about a week so they're all really hungry. And the nice thing about worms is you can even feed them before you go on vacation or something like that, and they'll be fine for several weeks without you caring for them. The only thing you need to worry about with worms is if it's too hot or too cold. And unfortunately for me, I learned this the hard way last summer. We had a couple of days where it was up in like 110. And so here in Foothill Ranch where I live, and I lost about 90% of my worms during that heat. So this year I'm going to be hyper vigilant, and I will bring my worms into the garage when that happens, because the temperature is much more moderated than the little shed that I have. And we rarely have to worry about weather that's hyper cold, but if it got around freezing or something, I'd probably bring them into the garage as well. It's one of the advantages of having a container that's easy to move. You can move it into some sort of place like into the house or into the garage. And as I mentioned, a lot of people just keep their worms inside their house in a closet or something. They're perfectly happy wherever they're at, just as long as they're not in a really sunny place. They don't like direct sun, so you want to keep them in someplace shaded area typically. So when you do that, you can either dump the container out onto a piece of plastic or a tarp, and then the worms, once again, they don't like light, so they're going to move towards the center, and you can grab the edges and grab the compost that way, and they'll just keep moving tighter and tighter into the center, so until you end up with almost like a ball in the center. With what I do, once they move down, I take the lid off and it dries, and put it out in the sun, and it drives the rest of them down because they don't like the light, and I can scrape it off and work it that way. On some of these other ones, they just simply say, take the bottom container and then go. For actual compost, you can screen it. This is the best way I found for a homeowner to create a screen, and this is how I started. This is just a 2x4, 8 foot long, cut into 4 sections, so each side is 2 foot wide. And then my early ones I nailed onto the bottom, and this is 1/4-inch mesh over here on the left, and on the right is 1/8 inch mesh. This is easy to find at any big box store, or most hardware places that sell hardware will have this 1/4-inch mesh. The 1/8 inch is a little harder to find, but I found this place. Most of you don't know about it. It's called Amazon. And if you go there, you can just say 1/8-inch hardware mesh, and you'll find a, last time I bought it was $15 for a roll of it. And I was able to make 2 of these screens out of the roll with some left over. This is a slightly better one that has an inner piece of wood that I did after the fact, and it doesn't push away like this is doing here. But these work just fine, and you don't need anything fancier. Now that I take my gardening very seriously. This is what I have now. This is 1/8 of an inch. This is 1/4 of an inch, and it's rotating by this motor right here, and it's belt driven. I'm probably one of the few people in California that have a home trommel like this. So, but you don't have to worry about anything that big. This works fine for the average homeowner. I just do a lot of material. You don't have to screen. It's you can just use it the way it is. But the reason I like screening it is because I use the fine. You'll see this in a second as we get to it. Okay, our last question is, what is vermicomposting? What is vermicomposting?
Hey, Greg, this is Juan.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody. So this is question number 3. So remember to submit your answers by 5 p.m. tomorrow, July 8th, to writescape@irwd.com. Thank you, Greg.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, really quick about the conservation kit. Inside is a moisture meter, rain gauge, hose timer, hose repair kit, and a shut-off hose nozzle.
Excellent. Excellent. Now, the last step is to actually use it. And there are 2 ways that you can use your compost. When I mentioned the screening, I sort of categorize it, and these are my own definitions, but as fine, medium, coarse, or chips. And most of the compost that you buy commercially is screened at either a 1/2 inch or 5/8 of an inch. So it's either, a lot of it is fine, but a lot of it will be, you'll get a lot of coarse pieces and bigger pieces in there. And so when you have this, you can use compost in 2 ways. You can use it either as an amendment, and what that means is that you're mixing it into the ground. Or you can use it as a mulch, which means that you're spreading it on top of the ground. And a mulch is usually much bigger or coarser, like chips and that, than your amendment material would be. So on annuals, if you're mixing it into soil, and annuals usually grow in the top 6 inches, so you can make it up to, I would make it no more than 1/3 of like a blend for potting soil or something like that. And for trees, less than 10%. And once again, it just at the very top portion, the very top few inches, if you're growing them in a pot or something like that. And when it breaks down, it'll get lower slowly. And then if you want to use this for lawns or whatever, just you can spread the fine stuff on, rake it into the lawns, and it'll, without using any harsh chemical fertilizers, and that'll really make your lawn better.
Great.
Mulch.
Greg, share your screen again. Sorry about that.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Get back to here.
We got it, you guys.
So I can screen this to share. Okay, share. Share screen 1. Share. There we go. Everyone got that? Okay. So this is, once again, for using it as an amendment. For mulching, you can take your layers. For mulching, these are your upper layers. So the coarser layers, coarser, like the chips would go on top of the coarse stuff. And so that would be on top of the ground. with the really coarse stuff, the chips being on top. And it can be 2 to 3 inches or up to 6 inches in some cases. And this is great. If you have trees or wherever you have ground, you want to have a nice layer of mulch. It's going to keep water in. It's going to keep weeds away. It's going to break down over time so that it's going to add nutrients to the ground to just keep this going. And remember, compost happens, so it's going to gradually break down. And so you just add more every year, and it just works with it. The only caveat is to keep it away from the tree trunk. So you create a little circle or an edge around 2 to 6 inches so that it's not right up against the tree trunk. The bigger the tree trunk, the further away it should be. There's problems if you get it right up because moisture will get in there and insects will use it as a way of getting into the tree. So you keep it away, but just that little distance away from the trunk, and it's just wonderful. And one last thing, if you can blend it, do it. I blend up to 5 points, and that's why I have my compost. I have my Vermi Compost. Plus, I buy compost from other places, and there are several of the different composting facilities. You'll get a sheet that'll give you all the ones that are locally. It was created last year. Some of the prices might be out of date, but all good places. All are pretty much do their composting in an organic manner. Very careful about how they choose their feedstock, so it's really high quality. And with that, if you have any questions we don't get to answer today, this is the website for the Orange County Master Gardeners and our hotline, and you can just take like a picture and send us an email, and a group will research your question, give you evidence-based answers from the UCCE system, and you'll be able to know that you're getting the best quality information, not just something my Aunt Mary said worked for me one time type stuff. And with that, let's see what we got about questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Greg. What a fantastic presentation. We'll use this time to go ahead and do some Q&A. I know some of the Master Gardeners have been answering questions in the chat feature, but once again, we'll try to, we're going to save all these and set it up and organize it and also get it back to you guys when we do hand out the present, or send the link to the video of the presentation. Okay. Jean?
Yeah. So there are several types of questions. So I'm going to kind of ask them not in the order they came in, but in the order of the topic. There are a lot of specific questions about worms.
Mm-hmm.
So let me go with those first. People ask, where can you get worms? And I believe, Greg, you said there's a list of where to get them, but maybe you can just address that real briefly.
Yeah. One of the things is this presentation is normally 2 one-hour presentations, one fully on worms, one fully on regular composting. So I had to pack a lot of material into a short amount of time. But there is one person in Orange County, he is on the sheet that has the composting, who also has worms available in Orange County. You can often find by just doing a search on like Craigslist or any of the other local sites, or even just a web search, to find people that will sell your red wigglers, your red worms. Worst case, if you want to start out small, you can buy the ones that you buy as fishing worms. You can start with one of those and put that in, but it's a very expensive way of doing it. You can get at the gentleman, he's in Cyprus, I believe, and he's actually in a jewelry store. So it seems weird, but he, as a hobby, he raises worms and sells them. But that's available. And I often will buy, like every 2 years, I buy a bunch off the internet just so I can add to my gene pool, because they reproduce very rapidly. and I'll expand out and I'll give some away. But at the same time, I want to have a diverse genetic pool. So I'll just go out and I'll buy some online from a different place each time, just to have something slightly different.
So another set of worm questions have to do with where exactly do you put worms? So one question is, can you put worms in your regular compost or only in a worm bin? And can you put worms in a tumbler? And there's a question, how many worms for a 10-gallon blue tub? And so maybe you could address some of those how to with worms issues.
Okay. Once again, this is not rocket surgery. So you can put usually about 1,000 to 2,000 worms in a tub. You start smaller because they do reproduce quite quickly. The thing is, you'll find that you'll be consuming a lot of food. If they consume the food on a regular basis in less than 3 days, you might have too many worms in your tub, and you want to split them off or take a bunch of them out and give them to a friend or something like that, which is that's how I got my worms initially, was from another gardener, not a master gardener, but another gardening friend who just got me started in worms.
Okay.
And the other thing, what was the other part of that question?
Well, there were some questions about worms in a regular compost bin, and there
are that's what it is. Okay.
Question about
remember that, especially on a hot bin, that it gets to 160 degrees. Okay, that's uncomfortable for any worm. They will leave the bin at that point, but worms always find their way back in when it cools down. You don't need to add them directly. You will find them if you are, especially if you're doing cool composting, the worms will find your compost bin. And I've been amazed where I've had plastic bags of compost that have just been sitting for a while, and when I take it apart, there are worms in it. I don't know if there were eggs when I started or what have you, but they reproduce, and so just having it, especially if it's on the ground where they can move in and out, they'll find, and they will aid in your breaking down, especially in a cool composting situation. So there's no harm in doing that, but if you want that optimal, let's create vermicompost as quickly as we can, that vermicast, having a bin and the worms dedicated and feeding them is the best way of doing that.
And so another question that just came through, can you actually add worms to a planter, for example?
Okay, remember, these worms are their purpose in nature is to break down decomposition. There are different worms that are the ones that are drilling in part of the earth itself. So these worms aren't really the same worms that you want to find when you're digging through your beds or your soil. That's a different species of worm. And they have a different thing. They're digging through the ground, they're aerating the soil and stuff like that. The ones we are using, the red wigglers, their basic role is to do the decomposition.
Okay. Now let's move on to materials. There were a lot of questions about materials. Certain materials that people were asking about include things like cat food, meat, citrus. There were several questions about citrus. Is that good or bad? And then somebody was asking about the inks from recycled paper, and someone else was asking whether when things get moldy, are those moldy things compostable?
Yes. Okay. Great questions. Great questions. And the answers are, most of that is totally compostable. As a matter of fact, if you've got spoiled fruits, vegetables, and things like that, I would recommend you just put them in a separate container, obviously, but you can store them in your ice box or something, or even freeze them if you've got a lot of stuff that seems to be going bad, and then let it thaw out and let the worms go. I forgot to mention that worms have very small mouths, So I tend to puree. A lot of people don't. They will just put like whole pieces of fruit and stuff in their worm bins and in a different spot each time. But I found that if I puree it, they eat it very quickly, and the microbes can also break it down very quickly. So it's a much more efficient, much quicker way of having these things break down. And if you freeze something, the ice particles penetrate the cell, and when you take them out, you know, when you thaw something that's frozen, it's very mushy. That is also makes it a lot easier for the worms to break it down. As far as all the different things, once again, we want to avoid meats and that, especially for because they tend to smell. They're very high in nitrogen, extremely high in nitrogen compared to plant material. And so we want to avoid putting them in a compost pile unless you are on 5 acres and away from all your neighbors. But living in our area, that's rarely the case, and they will smell. Citrus and the other things that are acidic, I tend not to put those in with worms. I found out worms do not like it acid, but I, for the longest time, had my bedding material 1/3 peat moss, which is extremely acidic, and never really noticed anything bad, but I stopped using the peat moss as part of my bedding material as a result of that. And I also don't put tomatoes, lemons, limes, things like that that are very acidic in that. But I put them in my compost pile, no problem at all. The coffee is slightly acidic, but it's not too much of a problem. And I don't put a ton in with my worms, but I put some in. The one other thing I forgot to mention is you'll want to put a little bit of ground up material like blended Easter egg, not Easter eggs, just regular eggshells or sand or stuff like that. The worms have a gizzard, and they take that and they use that to grind up food. So I put like a handful of playground sand, because with my grandkids I had a bunch of playground sand that I used for that. Just like a handful in each container as I'm setting it up, and that's plenty for the entire period when they're breaking that bedding down into usable compost.
Okay, thank you. And then some questions about composting with a compost pile as opposed to a worm bin. The one question is the rule of half green, half brown, is that strictly for the compost pile, or is that also for worm bins?
It's the same, but not in the same way. So in the compost bin, we're blending together greens and browns that are different types of plant material. In the worm bin, the bedding is your browns, and the food that you feed the worms are your greens. So you chop up your vegetables and stuff like that, and you're feeding that to the worms, and the combination will end up being that blend, but it's not this, and it will end up eventually over this period of time be a similar ratio, but you've got the worms accelerating this composting for you and not just purely the bacteria. So the ratio is not quite as critical, but it is still greens and browns. It's just that the bedding is basically the browns, and what you're feeding the worms are your greens. And once again, I puree, you don't have to, but if you can chop up whatever you feed them as much as possible, that really helps them consume it faster.
Okay, 2 more materials that people had questions about. One is eucalyptus, because of the oils. Is that bad or okay for composting?
Once again, for worms, anything that's oily, I avoid. You do not want to add anything that's oily, and especially like oily papers and things, or cheeses. Once again, very high in oils, and that's also a dairy product. But as for regular composting, that's not a problem. Even though the oils are there, it's not so much a problem. And same thing, you can use pine needles, which are very aromatic and have the pine oils as well. That's great for regular composting, but not for vermicomposting. The worms don't like that.
And what about eggshells?
Eggshells are fine. I like, I put several eggshells in when I make my food for the worms, and I puree them. In a compost pile, you can put them in whole. I do that on occasion, but they don't break down as quickly as I like, and sometimes it'll take a couple of uh, composting cycles before they break down all the way. So if you want to put them in a blender and just grind them up before you add them into your compost pile, it's a little bit more efficient that way. But it is a good source of calcium for the plants.
Right. And then another question about in the compost is, can you ever use too much coffee grounds? Can you overdo it on the coffee grounds, or is
On
that not a risk?
Yeah, um, I never go more than say 10% coffee grounds, but once again, that's like a bucket in a full cubic yard of, it's like a cubic foot in a cubic yard. So it's like 1/27th of the material I use when I put that in. You do really want to have a blend, a variety. I mentioned about blending compost. We don't want to eat the same thing, and our plants don't want to eat the same thing. So if we have a lot of different sources of feedstock and aren't too heavy on any one, where no one thing is more than 10%, that's best. If it's all tree X, that's not a good blend. You really want to have we all have different plants growing on our properties typically, so we can have that assortment to make it work out. Yeah, don't go too heavy on any one thing, especially coffee is fairly high in nitrogen. It's a great booster, but it's I use it like that as an additive to get it started in the beginning. But or if I need to bump it up because for whatever reason it didn't seem to get to the 160 degrees I wanted in my hot composting.
Okay. Then there are several questions that are related to problems with composting. One question is it okay to build your compost pile in the sun, or does it need to be in the shade?
Doesn't matter at all. It works fine. When it's out in the sun, you're going to have to keep it moist more often, so you're going to use a little bit more water than you would need to if you had it in the shade. Worms you definitely don't want in the sun. They do not like light. They do not like a lot of direct heat, and when you have direct sunlight on something, it heats up immensely. So you want to keep the worms in a shaded area. Um, as much as possible. I know some people that have their worm bins under trees, or like mine, I have a little shed that was built for them that has an awning to keep them going. But a regular compost pile can be just about anywhere, with the one caveat that you are going to be using more water if you have it out in the direct sun.
Okay. All right. Another question. Someone reports that they have uh, a trash bin, a rubber trash bin that's used as a compost bin, but this person's compost becomes watery and smelly, and there are also a lot of fungus flies there.
Yeah.
What's what's is that an indicator of something wrong, and what should be done about it?
Well, if you've got the smell, it's obviously especially if there's water at the bottom. If they're using a trash bin, I would recommend at least putting a hole or something in it so the water can drain out. And then this is one of those things where you want to turn it. So put some gloves on, reach down, or just dump it out and then put it back in the opposite way that it came out type thing, so that you're mixing it, and that will help with the problem. Also, you might need more browns if you're just throwing food scraps or something in there. That's just building up a lot of greens without having any complementary browns to deal with in a normal composting situation. So if it is something like that, that's an ideal thing where you shift over to doing vermicomposting, put that bedding in there, and just give those greens to the worms and let them have at it.
Okay, now what about making use of of the compost before it's completely finished. And a related question is sometimes there are large chunks and smaller chunks in the compost, and is that, you know, is that an issue, or what are the reasons for that happening?
It's just a lot of it is how big the material is. You can look at this picture here. You can see if I was to run this through something for screening it, I'd get a lot of really fine stuff, but you can see a lot of big pieces sitting on here. And it's just, you know, this is nature. It's not perfect. It's just how it happens. And even running things through the chipper, it's a lot of times there's some larger sticks that make their way through those chopping blades. It's just a function of how it works. And not be too afraid of it. This is one of the reasons why I like screening it, because the fine stuff is okay to mix in very shallow, but you don't want a lot of these big sticks in there, because that is in essence almost like unfinished compost. And if it's in the ground, it actually would have a tendency to draw it'll draw nitrogen and stuff away from your plants rather than providing it to them, which is the more finished compost would do. So that's why it's good to have it as a mulch on top. It's not competing with the plants, and it'll break down gradually. And by screening it, you can take care of that. And those little screening things I showed you would fit on a wheelbarrow like that just perfectly. They're about 2 feet wide. So you just sit it on there, shake it back and forth real quick, and that'll give you what you want. And the stuff that's too big, I personally run it through my chipper one more time, because it obviously needs to be a little bit smaller. And then I also recompost it. So the next time around, it'll be broken down even more. Just keep at it. Or you can just use it as a mulch.
Another question, why does my tumbling composter have large chunks and small white worms?
I don't know what large chunks would be, other than it just might be that once again, the tumbling composters aren't a real efficient way because they're just not very big. But the worms are probably a function of them. It would depend on the type of worm. This might be a question to submit to the master gardeners, where you can take a picture of exactly what type of worm it is and so on. But it may be that it's a little too much moisture in there, and you might need some more browns. But once again, I'm not personally a big fan of the tumbling type, because they aren't quite big enough in order to do as great of a composting. Now, if there's something like, you also see if they're actually worms, or if they're like maggots or something like that, which means that maybe soldier flies or some other flies are getting into your thing, and you might have to apply some sort of a screen where there's air getting in, but not insects. But once again, if you keep it tumbled, and whenever you put fresh vegetables or something in, bury them in the tumbler before you do the tumbling, so that they are hidden from view or harder for the insects to get to.
Okay, I think there's time for one last question, and that is, now I lost it. Oh, should soil ever be added to a compost pile?
No. Well, what we are doing is we are creating this very biologically active organic material, and we don't need to add soil to it. You can add compost to soil to make like a potting mix or something like that. But once again, that percentage should be no more than 1/3, and only if you're planting annuals or something else that's very shallow. You don't want to use it for planting a tree, except for blend it in as an amendment in the top couple of inches. But yeah, there's absolutely no reason for adding soil to it. Well, putting a handful of soil in to provide that grit for the worms in vermicomposting, like I put sand, but I could just easily pick up a handful of dirt and throw it in there. That gives them the grit to help process their food, but that's about it.
Okay. Carlos, I think back to you.
Everyone.
Or do we have time for more questions?
I think we this let's see, it's 1:30. I think we're okay.
Okay. So, yeah. So because there are lots of questions. Should
Yeah,
I
there's
keep
lots
asking
of questions. You know, why don't we just stop it here, and then we can make sure that I've been just noting all the questions down. So I'm just putting together on a word spread on a word, and I'll send it out. And there's a lot of answers within there already. So it's about organizing together, but we'll just make sure we address anybody else's questions that might have been missed. So, okay.
Okay.
Okay, Greg, thank you so much again. What a fantastic presentation. Ladies, thank you for joining us and assisting Master Gardeners. And my staff, I appreciate your time, of course, and everybody that joined us today. Thank you so much for sticking around for the very end. And this presentation is being recorded and it will be posted. So just look out for that email. Hopefully the email will go out by the end of this week. If not, early next week, we'll get it out to everybody with links, the winners of the conservation kits, and also a lot of handouts. Like Greg said, there's some great handouts with sites where you can go purchase materials, some instructions on building bins and so forth. Also, remember, make sure to check out the Master Gardeners website. They have great information on there as well. They have a great a hotline where you can submit questions to Master Gardeners, and also there's also a 6-part series composting video series on there. Is that correct, Greg? I believe so. Right.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's all kinds of stuff on
A
there.
bit dated, but still
Oh,
everything you need to know. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And also on our, if you follow the link on the IRWD rightscapenow.com website, we do have past recordings of past workshops. You're free to go take a look at them. And we have everything. Master Gardeners, we've done this in the past as well, but we try to update it every year with the newest ones that come around. So I know the edible gardening workshop was a big blast a couple of weeks last month, and it is on there. So take a look, enjoy the workshops, and just be on the lookout for other workshops that are brought to you throughout the year from Master Gardeners and from IRWD. So once again, great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a great week. Go practice, and let's get some composting going. I know I got to go look at my bed right now after this. So I guess enjoy this beautiful weather we're having, and have a great summer, everybody. Hopefully see you soon.